My daughter exposed her stepmother's secrets at my wedding reception, and I'm grateful she did. The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor exactly 3 seconds after my daughter stood up during the toasts. Everyone in the ballroom turned to stare at her, this 17-year-old girl in a navy dress she'd picked out herself, holding a manila folder like it was a weapon. My new wife, married for exactly 43 minutes, had gone pale as death. I was still smiling, thinking this was some sweet father-daughter speech moment I'd seen in wedding videos online. Then my daughter opened that folder, and my entire world detonated. She looked directly at the woman I'd just vowed to spend my life with and said 6 words that made the room go silent. Her real name is Vanessa Pritchard. The bride's face did something I'd never seen before. It crumpled and hardened at the same time, like watching a mask crack, but stay perfectly in place. That's when I knew my daughter wasn't joking. I'd been planning this wedding for 8 months, ever since I proposed to the woman I knew as Isabel Thornton on a beach in Malibu. We'd met at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital where I served on the board. She was a development coordinator, or so she said, with this incredible smile and a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. My daughter Olivia had been living with her mother since our divorce 6 years ago, visiting me every other weekend and some holidays. When I introduced them 4 months into my relationship with Isabel, Olivia had been polite but distant. I told myself it was normal. Teenagers don't want their parents dating. She'd warm up eventually. The wedding planning moved forward despite Olivia's increasingly cold responses to my texts about bridesmaid dresses and reception details. She refused to be in the wedding party, saying she'd rather just attend as a guest. I'd been hurt but tried to understand. My ex-wife told me to give her space, so I did, throwing myself into wedding preparations and my relationship with Isabel. The first weird thing I noticed was 3 months before the wedding when I checked my savings account for the venue deposit. The balance was $15,000 lower than I remembered. I called the bank thinking there'd been an error, but they showed me a wire transfer I'd authorized to a wedding planner in Santa Monica. Except we weren't using a wedding planner in Santa Monica. We'd hired someone local. When I asked Isabel about it, she got this confused look on her face and explained that she'd changed planners because the first one had terrible reviews. She showed me Yelp screenshots and apologized for not telling me sooner. The explanation made sense. I felt foolish for questioning her. But something about how quickly she had those screenshots ready bothered me for about an hour before I pushed it away. Looking back now, that was my first chance to catch her. I didn't take it because I was already too deep in, too committed to the fantasy of starting over with someone who seemed perfect. Olivia started missing our scheduled visits around this same time. She'd text the morning of saying she had too much homework or wasn't feeling well. When I'd call her, she'd answer but keep conversations brief and surface level. How's school? Fine. How's your mom? Fine. Are you excited about the wedding? I guess. I told Isabel I was worried about my daughter pulling away, and she suggested that maybe Olivia needed therapy to process the divorce. She even found a therapist who specialized in children of divorce and offered to pay for the sessions. I thought it was incredibly thoughtful. I made the appointment and told Olivia about it. She said she'd think about it but never went. Instead, she started asking me strange questions during our phone calls. Questions about Isabel's past, about where she worked before the hospital, about her family. I gave vague answers because, honestly, I didn't know many specifics. Isabel had told me her parents were dead and she was an only child. She'd grown up in Boston and moved to California for college. The details were fuzzy, but I'd never pushed because she got emotional when talking about her childhood. The second incident happened 6 weeks before the wedding during a Sunday brunch at my house. Isabel had moved in with me the previous month, bringing surprisingly few belongings for someone in their mid-30s. 2 suitcases of clothes, a laptop, some books. She said she believed in minimalism and liked fresh starts. I found it charming. That Sunday, Olivia showed up unannounced while Isabel was in the shower. My daughter walked straight to my home office and started looking through the filing cabinet where I kept financial documents. I found her there 10 minutes later, reading through bank statements with this intense expression on her face. When I asked what she was doing, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said she needed to show me something. But then Isabel appeared in the doorway wearing my bathrobe, her hair still wet, asking if everything was okay. Olivia's whole demeanor changed. She shoved the papers back in the drawer, said, "Never mind," and left before I could stop her. Isabel suggested that Olivia was acting out because she was jealous of our relationship. She said teenage girls often compete with stepmothers for their father's attention. It sounded reasonable. I called Olivia that night to talk about boundaries and respecting privacy. She listened in silence and then asked me one question. "Do you trust me?" I told her of course I did, but actions have consequences. She hung up without saying goodbye. My business partner noticed the financial irregularities before I did. I owned a commercial real estate investment firm with my best friend from college, Nathan Greenfield. We'd been building the company for 15 years and trusted each other completely. Nathan called me into his office 3 weeks before the wedding with our accounting manager, a detail-oriented woman named Lucia Fernandez, who'd been with us for a decade. They showed me a series of transfers from our business account that I supposedly authorized. 6 separate wire transfers over 3 months, each between $20,000 and $30,000, going to various vendors for property maintenance and renovation projects. The problem was, we hadn't scheduled any major renovations in those timeframes. The properties listed on the transfer notes were either recently sold or still vacant. Nathan asked me directly if I'd authorized these payments. I looked at the digital signatures on the authorization forms and felt my stomach drop. They looked exactly like my signature, but I had no memory of signing them. Lucia pulled up the IP addresses where the authorization forms had been submitted. They all came from my home computer during hours when I was typically at work. Isabel worked from home 3 days a week. I drove home that afternoon with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I had signed those forms and forgotten. I'd been distracted with wedding planning and busy with other deals. Maybe Isabel had logged into my computer to check something and accidentally clicked approve on pending transactions. There had to be an explanation that didn't involve the woman I was about to marry, systematically stealing from my business. When I walked through the front door, Isabel was in the kitchen making dinner, humming along to music playing from her phone. She looked so normal, so genuinely happy to see me. I watched her move around the kitchen, and I couldn't reconcile this person with someone who would embezzle from my company. So I asked her casually if she'd used my computer recently. She said yes, once last week to print out seating charts because her laptop was updating. She apologized if she wasn't supposed to and offered to only use her own devices going forward. The explanation was simple and innocent. I felt like a paranoid idiot for even suspecting her. That night, I told Nathan and Lucia there must have been some confusion with the paperwork, and I'd look into it after the wedding. Olivia called me at 11 o'clock that same night, which was unusual because she typically texted. Her voice sounded strained when I answered, and she asked me to meet her for breakfast the next morning before work. Just the two of us, at our old spot downtown, where we used to go every Saturday when she was younger. I said yes immediately, relieved she was reaching out. But when I mentioned it to Isabel, she reminded me that tomorrow morning was our final venue walkthrough with the caterer and florist. She'd scheduled it weeks ago and really needed me there since I was handling payment. I looked at her disappointed face and felt torn. This was important to her, to us, to our future. I could have breakfast with Olivia any time. So I called my daughter back and asked if we could reschedule for later in the week. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Olivia said in this flat voice that it was fine, and she'd see me at the wedding. Something about her tone made me want to call her back immediately, but Isabel was already pulling me into bed, talking about flower arrangements and whether we should do a chocolate fountain at the reception. The wedding day arrived faster than I expected, like time had skipped forward while I wasn't paying attention. I woke up at the hotel where the ceremony and reception were being held, in a suite that cost more than my first car. Nathan was there as my best man, helping me with my tie and making jokes to calm my nerves. He mentioned casually that he'd hired a forensic accountant to look into those strange wire transfers, just to be safe. The accountant had found some concerning patterns, but needed more time to complete the investigation. I felt a flash of anxiety, but Nathan clapped me on the shoulder and said we'd deal with it after I got back from the honeymoon. Today was about celebrating. I pushed the worry down and focused on getting ready. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia saying she'd arrived and was in her hotel room. I sent back a heart emoji and told her I couldn't wait to see her. She didn't respond. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Isabel walked down the aisle in a dress that cost $8,000, and I felt this surge of emotion watching her approach. She looked perfect. Everything looked perfect. The flowers, the lighting, the string quartet playing our song. Olivia sat in the third row wearing that navy dress, her expression unreadable. I tried to catch her eye during the vows, but she was staring at Isabel with this intensity that made me uncomfortable. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I kissed Isabel and heard polite applause from the 150 guests we'd invited. My new wife whispered that she loved me, and I believed her completely. We walked back down the aisle together, her hand in mine, and I remember thinking that this was the beginning of something wonderful. I had no idea I was wrong about everything. The reception started with cocktail hour while the ballroom was being set up for dinner. I circulated among guests, accepting congratulations and making small talk with relatives and business associates. Isabel was radiant, laughing with my aunt and complimenting my mother's dress. My ex-wife had graciously declined to attend, saying it would be too awkward, but she'd sent a nice gift and her best wishes. I kept looking for Olivia in the crowd but couldn't find her. When I finally spotted her, she was sitting alone at a table in the corner, that manila folder I'd seen earlier sitting in front of her. She was on her phone, texting rapidly with a focused expression. I walked over to ask if she was okay, but the wedding coordinator intercepted me, saying we needed to do photos before the sun set. By the time I finished with the photographer an hour later, dinner was being served and I'd lost track of my daughter again. The toasts were scheduled to happen between the main course and dessert. Nathan stood up first and told embarrassing stories about our college days that made everyone laugh. My mother went next, getting emotional about how proud my father would have been to see this day. Isabel's best friend, a woman named Adrienne, who I'd only met twice, gave a generic speech about love and happiness that felt like she'd pulled it from a wedding website. Then there was an awkward pause where the coordinator looked at her list, confused. That's when Olivia stood up from her table in the back, manila folder in hand, and walked to the microphone. The coordinator tried to stop her, saying she wasn't on the speech list, but my daughter gently moved her aside and tapped the microphone twice. The feedback screech made everyone wince. I smiled encouragingly, thinking she'd decided to say something nice after all. That's when she looked at Isabel and dropped the bomb. Her real name is Vanessa Pritchard. The words hung in the air like smoke. I watched Isabel's face change, and I knew in that instant that my daughter was telling the truth. But I didn't want to believe it yet, so I started to stand up, ready to laugh this off as some kind of misunderstanding. Olivia held up her hand to stop me and continued talking. Her voice was steady, but I could hear it shaking underneath. She's wanted in 3 states for financial fraud and identity theft. She's done this to 4 other men before you, Dad. I sat back down hard. The ballroom had gone completely silent, except for the sound of someone's fork hitting their plate. Isabel was shaking her head, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. Olivia opened the folder and started pulling out papers, holding them up one by one. This is a marriage certificate from 2019, showing her married to a man named Richard Blackwell in Arizona. This is a police report from 2021, where she was accused of stealing $200,000 from her employer in Nevada. This is a photograph of her using the name Monica Sterling at a charity event in Oregon last year. I felt like I was watching this happen to someone else. My brain couldn't process the information fast enough. Guests were whispering to each other, pulling out their phones to record this disaster. Isabel finally found her voice and started screaming that this was insane, that Olivia was mentally unstable and making everything up. She turned to me with tears streaming down her face, begging me to believe her, saying my daughter was trying to destroy our happiness out of jealousy. I looked at Olivia, who was now holding up printouts of bank statements highlighting those wire transfers Nathan had found. My daughter's voice got louder, cutting through Isabel's protests. She stole $180,000 from your business in the last 3 months, Dad. She's been systematically draining your accounts and transferring money to offshore banks. She was planning to disappear right after the honeymoon. I felt Nathan's hand on my shoulder as he stood up, his face pale. He confirmed quietly that the forensic accountant had found exactly what Olivia was describing. The room erupted into chaos. Isabel or Vanessa or whoever she really was made a run for it. She kicked off her heels and sprinted toward the ballroom exit in her wedding dress, but hotel security had already been alerted by someone and blocked the doors. I watched her trapped there, chest heaving, mascara running down her face, looking nothing like the woman I thought I'd married. Olivia walked over to me and handed me the folder. Her hands were steady now, and she looked older than 17. I'm sorry, Dad. I've been trying to tell you for months. I wanted to stop her before she destroyed you completely. I opened the folder with shaking hands and started reading through the documents my daughter had compiled. Police reports from multiple states, marriage certificates under different names, testimonials from other men she'd scammed, each one describing the same pattern. Meet at a charity event, move fast, isolate the target from family, drain accounts, disappear. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized. I looked up at my daughter and asked how she'd found all this. Olivia explained that she'd gotten suspicious the first time she met Isabel, because her stepmother-to-be had asked too many questions about my finances. She'd started with simple Google searches and found gaps in Isabel's story that didn't add up. No social media presence before 3 years ago, no college records, no employment history that could be verified. So Olivia had hired a private investigator using money she'd saved from her part-time job, a retired detective named Frank Morrison who specialized in identity fraud. The name made me flinch because I recognized it. Frank Morrison had tried to contact me twice in the past month, calling my office and leaving messages that I'd never returned because I'd been too busy with wedding preparations. Isabel had actually answered once when he called my cell phone during dinner and told him he had the wrong number. My daughter had been trying to save me while I was pushing her away, dismissing her concerns, and choosing a con artist over my own child. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Hotel security called the police while we all stood there in this terrible frozen tableau. Isabel stopped trying to run and just collapsed into a chair, still in her wedding dress, crying these horrible, wrenching sobs. Part of me wanted to comfort her out of pure instinct, but Olivia moved to stand between us like a shield. The guests didn't know what to do. Some were filming on their phones, others were gathering their things to leave. My mother was crying into my aunt's shoulder. Nathan was on his phone with our lawyer, explaining the situation in a low, urgent voice. I sat at the head table, still in my tuxedo, holding this folder full of evidence that my marriage was a fraud and had been from the very beginning. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. Detective Lisa Hartwell, about 50 years old with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, took charge immediately. She looked at the documents Olivia had prepared and then called for backup. Within an hour, the ballroom had been cleared except for immediate family, hotel security, and law enforcement. Detective Hartwell interviewed each of us separately, starting with Olivia. I watched through the ballroom doors as my daughter sat calmly answering questions, occasionally referencing additional documentation she'd brought. She was poised and articulate, nothing like the emotional teenager I'd expected. When it was my turn, Detective Hartwell asked me to walk through my entire relationship with the woman I'd married that morning. I described meeting her at the charity event, our first date at an expensive restaurant she'd suggested, how quickly she'd integrated herself into my life. The detective took notes and asked specific questions about money. Had I given her access to my accounts? Had I noticed any unusual purchases? Had she ever pressured me to make financial decisions quickly? As I answered, I realized how many red flags I'd ignored. The way she'd suggested I add her to my credit cards for wedding expenses. How she'd encouraged me to move investments around for better returns. Her insistence on handling vendor payments herself to save me time. Every memory was now tainted with this new understanding. Detective Hartwell explained that she'd been working with the FBI on a multi-state investigation into a woman matching Isabel's description for the past 18 months. They'd connected her to at least 6 different identities and 13 victims across the western United States, but she'd always disappeared before they could build a solid case. The wedding had been their best opportunity to catch her with a fixed location and date. They'd actually been planning to arrest her today, but Olivia's public exposure had forced them to move faster than planned. The detective asked if I would be willing to press charges for the theft and fraud. I said yes immediately, my voice sounding strange and hollow in my own ears. Then she asked if I wanted to speak to the woman I'd married before they took her to the county jail. I thought about it for a long moment, and then said no. There was nothing left to say to someone I'd never really known. They led her out in handcuffs around midnight, still wearing her wedding dress because she had no other clothes at the hotel. I watched from a distance as she was put into the back of a police car, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost. She didn't look at me. The ballroom staff had already started breaking down the reception setup, removing centerpieces and folding chairs like they were erasing evidence of the disaster this day had become. The wedding cake sat untouched on its table, 5 tiers of buttercream and flowers that would never be cut. Nathan offered to handle the vendors and the hotel bill while I dealt with the immediate legal mess. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Dunbar who'd handled my divorce 6 years ago, arrived at 1 a.m. with paperwork to start the annulment process. She explained that given the fraud involved, the marriage could be declared void from the beginning, like it had never happened at all. I signed where she indicated, my hand steady now that the shock was wearing off and anger was taking its place. Olivia had been sitting quietly in the corner of the ballroom for hours, still in her navy dress, watching everything unfold. When the police finally said we could leave, I walked over to her, and we stood there looking at each other. I wanted to apologize for not believing her, for pushing her away, for choosing a stranger over my own daughter. But the words felt too small for what had happened. Instead, I asked if she wanted to get breakfast at our old spot, the one we'd gone to every Saturday when she was younger. Her face crumpled and she started crying for the first time all night, and I pulled her into a hug that lasted several minutes. We drove there in silence through empty streets, still in our formal clothes, and ordered pancakes neither of us could eat. Olivia finally explained everything she'd discovered over the past 4 months. How the private investigator had tracked Isabel's previous identities through marriage records and police reports. How each victim had followed the same pattern, meeting her at charity events and being systematically drained of their savings. How she'd tried to warn me multiple times, but I'd dismissed every attempt. The worst part was learning that Isabel had actively worked to isolate me from my daughter. The therapy suggestion wasn't about helping Olivia process the divorce. It was about making me think my daughter needed professional help, discrediting her concerns before she could voice them. The texts I'd received from Olivia canceling our visits hadn't all come from her. Isabel had been using a spoofing app to send messages from my daughter's number, creating distance between us while I was at work or distracted. Olivia had actually shown up for 3 visits that I supposedly canceled on her, receiving texts from my number saying I was too busy or not feeling well. We'd been manipulated into doubting each other, and it had almost worked perfectly. If Olivia hadn't been persistent enough to hire that investigator on her own, if she hadn't loved me enough to keep trying even when I pushed her away, I would have woken up after the honeymoon to find my accounts drained and my new wife vanished into whatever identity she'd prepared next. The forensic accountant Nathan hired, a meticulous man named David Chen, spent the next 3 days reconstructing the financial damage. He traced every fraudulent transaction back to its source, documenting how Isabel had used sophisticated techniques to make the transfers appear legitimate. She'd created fake vendor invoices using names similar to companies we actually worked with. She'd forged my signature on authorization forms using software that analyzed my previous signatures for authenticity. She'd even set up shell companies in Delaware and Wyoming to receive the stolen funds before moving them offshore. The total amount stolen was actually higher than the initial estimate, closer to $240,000 when you included the credit card charges and unauthorized loans she'd taken out in my name. David explained that recovering the money would be difficult, since much of it had already been moved to accounts in countries with strict banking privacy laws. He filed detailed reports with the FBI and our insurance company, warning me that the legal process would take months, or possibly years. Detective Hartwell called me a week after the wedding to update me on the investigation. They'd searched Isabel's belongings and found multiple passports under different names, prepaid phones, and detailed notes about my financial situation, including account numbers and passwords I'd never given her. She'd been planning this for months, possibly since before we even met. The charity event where we'd first encountered each other hadn't been coincidence. She'd researched the guest list in advance and identified me as a target based on my business success and recent divorce. Everything about our relationship had been calculated and deliberate, from her choice of clothing on our first date to the way she mirrored my interests and opinions. The detective said Isabel or Vanessa had given a full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing information about her previous victims and methods. She was looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering across multiple states. I had to tell my mother what happened in stages, because the full truth was too much for her to process at once. First, I explained that the marriage had been annulled. Then I told her about the theft. Finally, I showed her some of the evidence Olivia had compiled. My mother cried and apologized for not seeing through Isabel's act, saying she'd been charmed like everyone else. She asked how I was holding up, and I honestly didn't know how to answer. I felt humiliated that I'd been so easily manipulated, angry at myself for ignoring my daughter's warnings, grateful that Olivia had saved me from complete financial ruin, exhausted from the emotional whiplash of going from wedding day joy to complete devastation in a matter of hours. I was sleeping badly, waking up at 3 in the morning, replaying every conversation with Isabel and seeing all the lies I'd missed. My business partner suggested I take some time off, but I couldn't stand sitting alone in the house where she'd lived with me, touching my things and planning my destruction. The media somehow got hold of the story 2 weeks later. A local news reporter contacted me asking for comment on the wedding day arrest of a suspected con artist. I declined through Patricia, my lawyer, but they ran the story anyway, blurring my face but including enough details that people I knew could identify me. The headline called it a $1 million wedding day scandal, even though the theft was closer to $250,000. Nathan fielded calls from business associates asking if our company was financially stable. Some clients wanted reassurance that their investments weren't affected by my personal situation. I had to send formal letters explaining that the fraud was isolated to my personal accounts and had no impact on the business. It was humiliating and exhausting, and I understood for the first time what Olivia had risked by standing up at that reception with evidence. She'd known this would become public. She'd exposed herself to scrutiny and gossip to save me, and I hadn't even thanked her properly yet. I drove to my ex-wife's house on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the wedding. Olivia's mother answered the door with a knowing look on her face, like she'd been expecting me. She let me in without saying much and called Olivia down from her room. My daughter appeared at the top of the stairs looking uncertain, and I realized she probably thought I was angry about the public scene she'd caused. I asked if we could talk privately, and her mother showed us to the backyard patio where we used to have barbecues when we were still married. Olivia sat across from me at the picnic table, and I started by apologizing. I said I was sorry for not listening when she tried to warn me. Sorry for choosing someone I'd known for 8 months over the daughter I'd raised for 17 years. Sorry for making her feel like she had to handle this alone. She started crying again, and I came around the table to sit next to her. We talked for 2 hours about everything that had happened, and I learned details that made me sick to my stomach. Isabel had threatened Olivia directly during one of our weekend visits. She'd cornered my daughter in my home office and told her that if she tried to interfere with the wedding, she would make sure I cut Olivia out of my life permanently. She'd said she knew how to manipulate men like me, and a jealous teenage girl wouldn't stand a chance. Olivia had been terrified, but determined. She'd spent her savings on the private investigator and worked with him for 3 months gathering evidence. She'd skipped social events and stayed up late researching fraud cases and identity theft. She'd practiced what she would say at the wedding dozens of times, knowing she'd have one chance to make everyone listen. The night before my wedding, she'd almost backed down, scared that I would hate her for ruining what I thought was the happiest day of my life. But then she'd thought about what would happen if she stayed silent, and she'd decided that losing my love was better than watching me be destroyed. I told her she hadn't lost my love, that I was more proud of her than I'd ever been of anything, and that I was grateful she'd been brave enough to save me from myself. The preliminary hearing happened 6 weeks after the arrest. I attended with Patricia and Olivia, sitting in the gallery while prosecutors presented their evidence against the woman who'd called herself Isabel Thornton. She appeared in an orange jumpsuit looking nothing like the polished, sophisticated person I'd thought I was marrying. Her public defender tried to argue for bail reduction, but the judge denied it based on her history of fleeing before trial. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named Gregory Holmes, who looked too young to be handling such a complex case, outlined the charges systematically. Identity theft across 4 states, wire fraud involving 13 separate victims, and over $2 million in total losses, money laundering through shell companies and offshore accounts, conspiracy to commit fraud. He had bank records, witness statements, and forensic evidence that painted a picture of a woman who'd been running this scam for at least 7 years. Isabel, or Vanessa, sat expressionless through the whole proceeding, occasionally whispering to her lawyer, but never looking at the gallery where her victim sat. 3 other men attended the hearing, previous targets who'd been contacted by the FBI. One was a doctor from Oregon who'd lost his retirement savings. Another was a software developer from Nevada who'd remortgaged his house to give her investment capital that disappeared. The third was a retired teacher from Arizona who'd signed over his late wife's life insurance policy. We sat together in an awkward cluster, united by our shared humiliation and anger. During a recess, the doctor told me he was grateful his adult son had figured out what was happening before it was too late, much like Olivia had saved me. The software developer said his own daughter had stopped speaking to him for choosing Vanessa over family concerns. He'd only reconnected with her after his daughter was proven right. The retired teacher had no children and had lost everything. He was living with his brother now, trying to rebuild at age 68. Listening to their stories made me realize how lucky I was that Olivia had been persistent and resourceful enough to stop this before it went further. The investigation into my business accounts took 3 months to complete. The insurance company hired their own forensic accountant to verify David's findings before agreeing to cover some of the losses. They disputed certain transactions, claiming they didn't meet the criteria for fraud protection under our policy. Patricia had to negotiate back and forth, providing additional documentation and legal precedents. Eventually, they agreed to cover $180,000 of the stolen funds, leaving me responsible for the remaining $60,000 plus legal fees. Nathan and I had to restructure some company finances to absorb the loss without affecting our ongoing projects. We implemented new security protocols for financial authorizations, requiring dual signatures on any transfer over $5,000 and quarterly audits by an external firm. The changes were expensive and time-consuming, but necessary. I couldn't risk this ever happening again, either to me or to the business we'd built together. Nathan never said "I told you so," but I could see the concern in his eyes when he looked at me. He'd been skeptical of Isabel from the beginning, but had kept quiet out of respect for my happiness. The trial was scheduled for 8 months after the arrest, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Prosecutor Gregory Holmes contacted me multiple times, asking me to testify about my experience with the defendant. I agreed, though the thought of facing her in court made my stomach turn. He explained that my testimony would help establish her pattern of behavior and modus operandi. He wanted me to describe how we met, how the relationship progressed, how she gained access to my finances, and how I discovered the truth. I spent hours with Gregory and his team, going through every detail of my 8-month relationship with a woman who'd never existed. They asked uncomfortable questions about intimacy and trust, trying to understand how someone could maintain such an elaborate lie. I had to admit that I'd been lonely after my divorce, eager to believe in a second chance at happiness, and maybe not as careful as I should have been. Gregory assured me this wasn't my fault, that Vanessa was a professional predator who'd perfected her technique over years. But I still felt foolish. Olivia graduated from high school that spring with honors despite everything that had happened. I attended the ceremony with her mother, sitting together like we used to when Olivia was younger and our family was intact. My daughter gave a valedictorian speech about courage and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. She didn't mention the wedding day disaster specifically, but everyone in that auditorium knew what she was talking about. Parents who'd heard the news story looked at her with new respect. Teachers who'd worked with her through that stressful time smiled with pride. When Olivia walked across the stage to receive her diploma, I stood up and cheered louder than anyone else in the room. After the ceremony, she came over to where her mother and I were waiting and hugged us both. She said she'd been accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship to study criminal justice. She wanted to help other people recognize and escape from predatory relationships. I told her I'd support whatever she chose to do, and I meant it completely. The trial finally began on a Monday morning in late summer. The courtroom was packed with victims, law enforcement, media, and curious observers who'd followed the case online. Vanessa Pritchard, as the judge insisted on calling her despite her protests, that Isabel Thornton was her legal name, sat at the defense table in business casual clothing that her lawyer had probably chosen to make her look sympathetic. She'd lost weight in jail, and her hair was shorter, but I could still see the woman I'd thought I loved underneath the changes. Gregory Holmes presented his case methodically over 3 days. He called the private investigator who'd first identified Vanessa's pattern of fraud. He brought in FBI agents who'd tracked her movements across state lines. He presented forensic accountants who explained how she'd hidden her theft. He showed the jury marriage certificates, bank records, and victim impact statements. Each piece of evidence built on the last until the picture was undeniable. This woman had systematically destroyed lives for profit, and she'd done it with calculation and precision. I testified on the 4th day of the trial. Gregory walked me through my story step by step, from our meeting at the charity event to the wedding day revelation. I had to describe intimate details of our relationship in front of strangers, admitting how thoroughly I'd been fooled. Vanessa's defense attorney, a slick older man named Theodore Barnes, cross-examined me aggressively. He implied that I'd been negligent with my business finances and was trying to blame my own mistakes on his client. He suggested that my daughter had fabricated evidence out of jealousy. He questioned whether I'd really been as unaware as I claimed, hinting that I might have been complicit in moving money around for tax purposes and was now seeking a scapegoat. I kept my composure through his questions, responding honestly and letting the evidence speak for itself. But it was exhausting and demoralizing to have my credibility attacked when I was the victim. Gregory objected multiple times, and the judge sustained most of his objections, but the damage was done. The jury had heard the defense's alternative narrative. Olivia testified the following day. She walked into the courtroom in a professional gray suit I'd never seen before, carrying a leather portfolio that made her look older than 18. Gregory asked her to explain how she'd uncovered Vanessa's identity and gathered the evidence. My daughter spoke clearly and confidently, describing the investigation she'd conducted with Frank Morrison's help. She presented the timeline of her discoveries, the documents she'd collected, and the decision to expose everything at the wedding. Theodore Barnes tried to rattle her during cross-examination, suggesting she was a troubled teenager acting out against her father's remarriage. He implied she'd hired the private investigator using money stolen from me, making her as guilty of theft as his client. Olivia responded calmly that she'd used her own savings from 3 years of part-time work at a bookstore, and she had bank statements to prove it. Barnes shifted tactics, questioning why she'd chosen such a dramatic moment to reveal the truth instead of going to the police quietly. Olivia looked directly at him and said, "Because my father wouldn't have believed the police. He needed to see her face when the truth came out. He needed to see that she knew I'd caught her." The courtroom went silent, and I felt tears stinging my eyes. Other victims testified throughout the week, each one describing similar experiences. The pattern was always the same. Vanessa would target successful men who were emotionally vulnerable, recent divorcees or widowers looking for connection. She'd research their finances and vulnerabilities in advance, tailoring her personality to match their preferences. She'd move quickly to establish intimacy and trust, then systematically gain access to accounts and assets. She'd create urgency around financial decisions, pushing for large transfers or investments that benefited her shell companies. She'd isolate her targets from family members who might ask questions, and she'd disappear the moment she sensed exposure, moving to a new state with a new identity. The prosecution presented evidence of at least 15 different identities she'd used over 7 years, each one carefully constructed with fake documents and backstories. The jury listened to hours of testimony about destroyed lives and stolen futures, and I watched their expressions shift from curiosity to disgust to anger as they understood the scope of her crimes. The defense's case was weak and brief. Theodore Barnes called character witnesses who testified that Vanessa had been a good employee and kind neighbor at various points in her life. He presented a psychologist who suggested she suffered from complex trauma that drove her criminal behavior, making her less culpable. He argued that many of the transactions had been gifts from men who were trying to impress her, not theft. The prosecution dismantled each argument with documentation showing forged signatures and unauthorized access. Gregory Holmes brought in handwriting experts who proved the signatures on transfer authorizations didn't match the victim's actual signatures. He showed video footage of Vanessa accessing my home computer while I was at work, captured by the security system I'd installed but never monitored. The evidence was overwhelming and comprehensive. Vanessa herself didn't testify, probably on her lawyer's advice, which meant the jury never heard her explain or defend herself directly. After 2 weeks of testimony, both sides rested, and the case went to deliberation. The jury returned their verdict after only 6 hours, guilty on all counts: wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, conspiracy. I sat in the gallery watching as the verdicts were read one by one, watching Vanessa's face crumble as her future evaporated. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 3 weeks later. As Vanessa was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned and looked directly at me for the first time since the trial started. There was no remorse in her expression, only cold calculation, and I realized she was already planning her next move, thinking about appeals and reduced sentences and eventual release. She'd never actually cared about any of us. We'd been marks, nothing more, and she'd do it all again if given the chance. The thought made me feel sick, but also strangely free. I'd spent months wondering what I'd done wrong, why I hadn't been enough to make her choose honesty. Now I understood it had never been about me at all. Sentencing day arrived 3 weeks later. The judge allowed victim impact statements, and I'd prepared one with Patricia's help. I stood at the podium and read about how Vanessa's fraud had affected my life, my business, and my relationship with my daughter. I described the sleepless nights and the humiliation of having my trust exploited so thoroughly. I explained that while the financial damage had been significant, the emotional damage had been worse. She'd made me question my judgment and my worth. She'd driven a wedge between me and my daughter that we were still working to repair. I asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence allowed under the guidelines, both to punish her crimes and to prevent her from destroying more lives. Other victims spoke as well, some reading prepared statements and others speaking from the heart. The retired teacher broke down crying, describing how he'd lost his late wife's legacy and his dignity. The doctor explained that he'd had to delay retirement and continue working to rebuild his savings. Each testimony painted a picture of lasting damage that went far beyond money. The judge sentenced Vanessa Pritchard to 14 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. She'd also be required to pay restitution to her victims, though the judge acknowledged that recovery would be difficult, given that most of the money was gone. Vanessa would be 60 years old when she got out, her youth and beauty wasted in a cell, unable to use charm and manipulation as weapons anymore. I felt no satisfaction in watching her led away, only a deep exhaustion and relief that it was finally over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed asking for comments. I gave a brief statement thanking Detective Hartwell and Prosecutor Holmes for their work. I thanked my daughter for her courage and persistence. Then I got in my car and drove to Stanford University, where Olivia was settling into her freshman year. I took her out to dinner at her favorite Italian restaurant, and we toasted with sparkling water to new beginnings and hard-won wisdom. Rebuilding took time. I sold the house where Vanessa had lived with me, unable to stand being in the space she'd contaminated with her lies. I bought a smaller condo closer to my office and started fresh with furniture and belongings that had no association with her. I worked with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, talking through my experience and learning to recognize the manipulation tactics I'd missed. The sessions were painful, but necessary. I had to face how my loneliness had made me vulnerable, how my eagerness for a second chance had blinded me to obvious warning signs. The therapist helped me understand that while I bore some responsibility for ignoring red flags, I wasn't to blame for being targeted by a professional predator. She taught me how to establish healthier boundaries and trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Slowly, over months of work, I started to feel like myself again, or maybe like a wiser version of myself who'd learned an expensive lesson. My relationship with Olivia deepened in ways I hadn't expected. We started having dinner together every Sunday, a standing date that neither of us would break for anything. She told me about her classes and her new friends at Stanford. I told her about business deals and small victories in my recovery process. We didn't talk about Vanessa much, but her presence hovered over our conversations like a shadow. One night, about a year after the trial, Olivia asked me if I regretted meeting Vanessa at all, given everything that had happened. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her I regretted the pain and the financial loss and the time wasted on a lie. But I couldn't regret an experience that had shown me how strong and capable my daughter was. Her investigation and her courage at the wedding had revealed someone I'd raised but hadn't fully appreciated. She'd saved me when I should have been protecting her, and I was grateful for that gift, even though it had come wrapped in disaster. The insurance settlement and restitution payments trickled in over the following year. I recovered about 70% of what Vanessa had stolen, enough to rebuild my savings and invest in some new business ventures with Nathan. We expanded the company into residential properties, diversifying our portfolio and implementing strict financial controls at every level. I threw myself into work with renewed focus, finding satisfaction in building something real and sustainable. My mother started inviting me to dinner more often, worried I was isolating myself, but I appreciated the concern. My ex-wife and I developed a better co-parenting relationship, bonded by our shared pride in Olivia and our shared relief that the nightmare was over. Life settled into a new normal that was quieter and more cautious than before, but also more authentic. I wasn't dating and had no plans to anytime soon. The thought of opening myself up to that kind of vulnerability made my chest tight with anxiety. 2 years after the wedding that never really was, I attended Olivia's 20th birthday party at her apartment near campus. She'd invited friends from school, and I met the boyfriend she'd been dating for 6 months, a computer science major named Adrian, who seemed genuinely kind and respectful. Watching her laugh with her friends, confident and happy, I felt a surge of emotion that surprised me. This was who she'd become despite the trauma of that day. She'd turned her experience into purpose, studying criminal justice and volunteering with fraud victims through a campus organization. She was using what happened to help others, transforming pain into meaning. Later that night, after the other guests had left, Olivia and I sat on her balcony looking at the city lights. She asked me if I ever thought about contacting Vanessa in prison, maybe trying to understand why she'd done what she did. I told her honestly that I didn't need to understand. Some people were broken in ways that couldn't be fixed or explained. The only thing that mattered was that we'd survived her, and we were stronger for it. I think about that wedding day sometimes, about standing at the altar believing in something that was never real. I think about the moment my daughter shattered my illusions with truth I didn't want to hear. I think about how close I came to losing everything, my savings, my business, my relationship with Olivia, maybe even my sense of self. The humiliation of being so thoroughly deceived still stings when I let myself remember the details. But mostly, I think about Olivia, standing up with that manila folder, her voice steady despite her fear, choosing to save me even if it meant I might hate her for it. That's the image I carry forward. Not the fraud or the arrest or the trial, but my daughter's courage in the face of adult problems she shouldn't have had to solve. She'd been more of a parent to me in that moment than I'd been to her in months of dismissing her concerns. The role reversal had been uncomfortable and necessary, and it had changed our relationship forever. I was grateful for it, grateful for her, and grateful that the truth had come out before it was too late to recover. I'm grateful she did it because she saved my life in ways that go beyond money. She taught me to listen to the people who love me, to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and to value truth over comfort. She showed me that being vulnerable doesn't mean being stupid, but ignoring warnings from people who care about you definitely does. Most importantly, she proved that the family bonds I'd taken for granted were stronger than the romantic fantasy I'd chased. Olivia had fought for me when I wouldn't fight for myself. She'd done the hard thing, the unpopular thing, the thing that risked everything to protect someone she loved. That's a gift I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn. So yes, I'm grateful. Grateful she exposed the lies before they destroyed me. Grateful she was brave enough to stand up at that reception with evidence nobody wanted to see. Grateful she never gave up on me even when I gave up on her. And grateful that out of the worst day of my life came a lesson I'll never forget, and a relationship with my daughter that's stronger than it's ever been. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.